This is the first video in my series of Joseph Newman videos after having lost my Vinyasa channel on YouTube, where pretty much almost all of my Joseph Newman videos were stationed or located at. But now I'm making do with my remaining channels, and so one by one, hit and miss, pick and choose, I'll decide which videos to bring out of cold storage and repost them when I feel like it. I'm not in a position at this point to spend too much time. So this video has to do with free energy. You know, what is it? Why can it happen? And I'll tell you. And I'm using Joseph Newman as an example, so that's why I'm going to post this on my josephnewman.info website, because this is a perfect example, because I've already analyzed it per simulator in LT Spice. Now, it's true I made a presumption when I did those virtual reality simulations in which I assumed that what Joseph Newman told us is true, which is not the whole truth. I got it from Byron Brubaker that there's a little bit left out that's very important. But I was still on the mark. I was still in the ballpark, and that's pretty good, considering my limited information being no more than what Joseph Newman has told the rest of us in his book. You know, I have the 8th edition here, the hard copy, and there's the PDF versions of 4th edition or 1st edition, and then there's the video recordings of Joseph Newman and whatnot. So there's all this documentation, but it's still not the whole picture, because he kept one little secret, and that is what Byron shared with me, is that what's in the center of the coil rotating is not a permanent magnet per se. It is a canister of helium. Now, what the canister is made of and the properties of that canister, that I will leave to your speculation, or mine for that matter, because I don't know. The information I got from Byron is that if you take a glass globe and fill it with helium and wrap it with a copper coil, it has properties that it would not have had otherwise had you not filled that glass globe with helium. And this is all, though, about induction, right? It's not about voltage. It's about induction. All the voltage is in the very massive coil surrounding this rotating object in the center of it. And so Joseph Newman's device is a perfect example of what happens when you have two energy sources comprising two energy systems of two separate specializations that are very unique in electrodynamic theory. And you blend them to create your electricity. Eric Dollard has given us the formula for synthesizing electricity out of its component parts of: you have a varying electrostatic field within which is immersed a magnetic field, and because that implies time, variation of electrostatics over time, you get electricity. Now, in my simulation, what I realized, in order to get what Dr. Hastings' results that he had analyzed in chapter 6, I believe, if not 4, I believe it's chapter 6 of Joseph Newman's book, he said there was a slight reverse current recharging the battery pack. And since the battery pack did not get drained a whole lot of amperage in the first place, there was enough, it was easy enough to get reverse current to recharge the battery pack and keep it topped off. So the battery pack basically wore out through use, through aging process and through use, because there'd be some impedance in the battery pack, not a whole lot, but some, and that would of course heat up the battery pack and cause it to age a little more rapidly than if you don't use it and let it sit on the shelf. But it's still going to age even if you let it sit on the shelf. So it's not a perpetual motion machine in terms of the limitations of the lifespan of the components in the circuit, but it is perpetual motion, and I'm going to explain why. So the battery pack got recharged, but in order to do that, you have to have a second energy source in addition to the battery pack. There's no way you can do it with just the battery pack alone. It's impossible. Trust me. In the world of the simulator, you get to find out very excruciatingly to the point of perfection what gives and what doesn't, because you have to provide everything. You can't leave anything to chance or happenstance or good luck. Good luck. Which you're not, but it's not a question of luck, because luck cannot help you. You have to provide everything. So that's when I discovered it. In order to get the reverse current, you have to have a second energy source, and there's no other place for it to come from except the rotating magnetic field that I presumed to be emanating from the permanent magnet that Joseph Newman started with his muscles. So he had an input of energy, and it took, a good minute or two to get him, pushing to get that thing up to speed. And then you walk away for an hour or 30 minutes or several hours to wait for it to build up even more speed. And in the course of doing so, the massive coil of 15,000 henries in his small version, his table model, has a chance to build up its massive voltage of 600 volts, even though the battery supply is supplying only 300 volts, so it doubles its voltage. But the current coming from the battery pack is minor, and the current being resupplied or recharged back to the battery pack at the same time is slightly more than what's being drained. Now, according to John Bedini and Peter Lindemann and Aaron Murakami, that's not what you do with batteries. The chemistry of batteries is such. The quickest way to age your batteries is to charge and discharge them at the same time, and that's what we do in our a lot of our modern day convenience appliances, such as electric cars, laptops, anything with a lithium battery. It's pretty much designed to charge and recharge at the same time, and that's why they overheat, and that's why they don't last, because you're not supposed to. You either charge or you discharge, but never both at the same time if you want your batteries to last. It's just one point of trying to make them last longer. That's just one bullet point. Well, in Joseph Newman's motor, or his energy device I should say, the battery pack has a commutator, and the battery pack is only supplying voltage for the most part. Okay? It specializes in supplying voltage because of the impedance of the coil. The coil is so massive, it creates so much inductive resistance that there's no way that it's going to allow a whole lot of amperage drained from the battery pack. Yet it builds up voltage according to the voltage of the battery pack, and that's why Joseph Newman used 9-volt batteries strung in series, because he didn't need a whole lot of amp hours. All he needed was the volts, and he got so many of those 9-volt batteries together, you do the math, to supply 330, let's say, some odd volts to the coil. That's all he needed. But the commutator turned the battery pack on and off, and for 50% of the time. And for the last 20% of the off-duty cycle, off phase, he self-shorted the coil, merely to reduce arcing, because arcing wastes energy. Now, I found that by taking Newman's advice in his book, he says to put a capacitor across the coil, and by the way, somebody told him to do that. It wasn't his idea. I'll let you guess who. it actually reduces arcing. And I did one modification that Joseph Newman did not do. He did it differently. And in my simulation, so I don't know if this would work in real life. In real life, he used a neon tube without the ballast on a separate isolated coil that he would wrap around the primary. He'd wrap a smaller coil around that and connect the two ends of that smaller coil to a fluorescent tube without the ballast that normally comes with a fluorescent lamp. You leave out the ballast, and it weakly lit up, and it managed to provide a minor load to the circuit. But what I found in my simulation is that if you put a neon bulb in series with the capacitor that is across the massive coil, so that it's not separate, it's not isolated, you can actually do away with the self-arcing 20% of the last 100% of every duty cycle self-arcing of the coil to prevent arcing, because between that and the capacitor, the two of them in series and both of them in parallel across the massive coil, you won't have any problems with arcing, according to the simulation. Now, I don't know about real life, but according to the world of the simulator, which is the world of abstraction, okay? It's not that it's not realistic. There's no such thing as not realistic here. People don't understand there are two realities, and Plato distinguishes them. There's the realm of the ideal, which we call the abstract, and there's the realm of the concrete that we normally think is the only world there is, the real world. But that's not true. Anybody who knows anything about enlightenment knows that Akasha, the fifth of the five elements of nature, is the realm of abstraction, and it's very real. And without that, we couldn't engineer anything, because it's the realm of abstraction that the architect designs a building, that the engineer designs a bridge, that the electrical engineer designs a circuit. It's the realm of abstraction. There's nothing non-real about it. It's just not concrete. But it is abstract, based on the laws of nature that we presume are such, based on our understanding of nature. We call them laws, but we don't know what they are. We're not God. We didn't make them. But we assume them to be the case, inferred by our analysis of nature in its operation. But it's real. Even though we can't see it, just like we can't see God, right? Who knows if God exists? People claim they've spoken to God, you know? But we infer the unseen presence of some kind of supreme being that has orchestrated this beautiful creation filled with orderliness. And that orderliness is an abstraction as best it can be. It is not concrete, because when we get to concrete reality, it's anything but perfect. You know, we all know that. And that's the reality of the concrete world. It doesn't really work the way you expect it to. But the abstract world does, and the simulator gives us that abstract version of reality. So there are distinguishing characteristics to reality, and each one is unique. The abstract is one, the concrete is another, and never the twain shall meet, because they're two separate realities and they're both real. So the realm of the simulator gives us a reality that is real, but it's pure abstraction, and so we have to make sure we distinguish that, okay? But it's not non-real, and it doesn't lie. It never lies. It is if you misinterpret it and take it to be concrete. That's your fault and no one else's. Unless everybody else is doing the same mistake as you are. Alright? We got that squared away? So, as far as the abstract reality is concerned, there's no such thing as free energy in the sense that we can't account for where the energy is coming from, but it is perpetual motion, oddly enough. And that's because of the synthesis of electricity affords us that opportunity. And because when we synthesize, we are using multiple energy systems, in which one system will run one part of the circuit, another system will run another part of the circuit, and only one of those energy systems, at minimum, need be consumed to give us the energy output, the electrical energy output. And I'm going to tell you what's going on here. See, normally we are told a misconstruction, a misunderstanding, a under-understanding that is not the whole picture. It's true you can take voltage and deplete it to create current, but it's also true that you can take voltage and not deplete it to create current, but simply continue to use it as a source of pressure according to the conventional standard appreciation of what voltage is. I'll stick with that. You know, Byron Brubaker would like to beg to differ, but I want to change as little as possible the conventional view, because I'm not trying to shock you too much. It's going to be shocking enough as it is, with no help from me. So I'm trying to keep my help to a minimum of shockability here. So if we consider that voltage is pressure, we don't have to consume it. We just keep using it to provide pressure. Okay? And that we measure as volts, and that we call electrostatics. Fine and dandy. You know, Eric Dollard would like to call it the dielectric, but the magnetodielectric, but whatever. The longitudinal magnetodielectric. Well, let's just call it electrostatic. You know, voltage, pressure, whatever. Now, the consumable is the amps, which does not have to come from the volts. It can come from another separate secondary energy source, and that's the helium-filled canister that we set in rotation. Now, Joseph Newman gives an input of energy. It's kinetic, and it sets that canister in motion. But somehow, the interaction of the helium and I'm assuming the magnetizability of the canister, whether it's iron or copper or a mixture layered, you know, could be, we have no idea the fabrication of that canister. I have no idea of the fabrication of that canister. Let's put it that way. So I can't share with you. I can't even speculate. It's orgone wrapping, you know, in which you've got, basically, orgone wrapping is nothing more than floating plate capacitors. Or, excuse me, floating capacitor plates, because they're isolated from each other by way of insulation. So is there layering going on, and different iron layers, you know, electroplated thin layers? Maybe you have a magnetizable iron canister with a copper coating on the outside, an electroplated copper, or maybe on the inside, and maybe there's insulation between the two. Who knows? But it's filled with helium and it's metallic, and that's all I can tell you. Once he sets it into rotary motion with his hand, with his arm, and if you watch the video, the documentary, it's called Newman on Amazon. Watch it, rent it. It's a beautiful documentary. You'll get some clues there. It's good stuff. He literally has to use, and he's a bodybuilder, okay? So he built this machine according to his consciousness. I couldn't do it because I don't have the strength to think that way. I don't have the body to think that way. But he does. And it's a perfect example of what I'm trying to tell you, that perpetual motion is possible, just not free energy. We can account for all the energy, we just can't account for why it's perpetual motion. At least not yet, anyway. Eventually we'll be able to. But we still have to take it on faith, because there's some things we'll never be able to explain, because they just come from, you know, the Creator, whatever that means. So once he gets it set in motion, that energy is amplified and, I have to say recycled. I have to speculate it's recycled. In other words, it's reused. Now, when Byron Brubaker shared with me the coil wrapping around a glass globe filled with helium, let's presume, because I didn't ask him for this detailed bullet point, that the coil is connected to itself, which means it's got nowhere to deplete its energy that's going that's zipping around inside that metallic canister. Now it may not be a metallic canister. It may just be a canister of some construction in which it has a coil winding inside a double-walled canister arrangement or geometry of its structure. Who knows? You know, it might be insulated wire winding that he's hiding, or it might just be on the inside of the canister rather than the outside. Who knows? Whatever it is, it's filled with helium, and it's not a solid brick of a permanent magnet. And I'm taking it on faith that Byron Baker knows this stuff, because, you know, he appears to me to be a sincere person who may be a little simple-minded by conventional standards, and that's why people think he's a little hooey. But I work the same way, you know, so I can appreciate where he's coming from. And that's the way you're supposed to solve problems. You're not supposed to make it complicated just so you can, you know, show off your pride and your vanity of how complicated you can make things, when you could have made it very simple and get over the anomaly of some apparent overunity, you know, or free energy or perpetual motion. You keep it simple, right? So, slightly complicated, but not too complicated. So once he sets it in motion, it recycles its energy and amplifies it at the same time. But the energy is not electrical, all right? It's magnetic. But because it spins, it becomes a field, a magnetic field, a rotating magnetic field. And it's going to exhibit some volts, but not much for the most part. You always have to have some volts and some amps to have either magnetism or electrostatics. There's no way you can avoid it. The question is, how much of each? And how is it behaving? So because it's a rotating magnetic field, automatically we know, according to Michael Faraday, that's amps right there. And the massive coil surrounding that will pick that up, because the massive coil is acting as a pickup antenna. Okay? If nothing else, it's acting as a receiving antenna. But it's already filled with volts from the battery pack. So now we're blending the amps delivered by the rotating magnetic field coming from this helium vessel and the voltage supplied by the battery pack that gets lodged in the coil, and it's able to build up its voltage to 600 volts. And give us a mechanical advantage, because that's what Joseph Newman's device is good for. It's not good for, you know, producing electricity. You can forget it. You know, watts? Are you kidding? Forget it. Who are you kidding? And I don't, you know, it's kinetic energy that it's creating, but it has to use electrical energy to do it, and it synthesizes electricity to do that. So electrical energy in has to equal electrical energy out. But if we're talking about the other aspect of energy that's involved here, it has something to do with the chemistry of helium interacting with a magnetic field. And that's something I know nothing about. But that is what is being consumed. And in my simulation, the amps supplied by that rotating magnetic field is humongous. Even though the electrical energy in my simulation that I had to use to supply it is so teeny, it's like microamps or something. But what ends up getting delivered by what in my simulator, I used a rotating coil. No, I used a rotating AC field. I used an AC input to represent that rotating magnetic field. The amount of amps supplied is like microamps or nanoamps or something from the source, the AC source. But once it gets to the coil, see, I have to use a coil as a transmitter that represents the rotating magnetic field. In that coil is something like megaamps or gigaamps. It's huge. It literally, because the the resistance is low, and the impedance is extremely low. It's below the value of 1. It's a fraction of 1. And so you get this magnification of amperage at the expense of volts, which is okay, because we got all the volts we need coming from the battery pack. So what do we need volts coming from the AC source for? We don't. And this is the inner... And now, it's not enough to say that this blends in the massive 15,000 Henry coil. Electricity is consciousness. As such, it extends itself throughout all of reality. When Carlos Castaneda talked or shared with us his teaching from his master, Don Juan Matus, Don Juan Matus's teaching is that if you were to see the aura of a being, a human being or a creature, it's not merely a sphere of light in the subtle realm, in the astral kingdom, let's say, or in the let's leave it at that. It's more than that. In terms of details, it's actually what it is. It looks like a fuzzy ball, but what it really is are these lines of light or energy which end at one point on that line out somewhere in the universe and then ends within the individual. And it's like a neural network in the brain, in which you've got all these connections, gazillion of them, coming to one central location that represents that human being, let's say, while they're alive, before they die. All tied up in a bundle, creating the appearance of a fuzziness that looks like an egg turned on its tip, walks around, bobbing around. But it's a bundle of nerve fibers of what we would say in the Sanskrit nadi, energy pathways. Now, Eric Dollard's perspective, we would call it, to translate that into electrical dynamic theory, is to translate that into longitudinal magnetodielectric lines of force in counter space, not in space. This is why it takes subtle vision to see it, because it's not in space. It's in counter space, which isn't exactly the astral plane. It's the antikarana, the bridge between the physical and the physical spatial and the astral, which is normally called the ether or the vital body, the etheric body in the 1800s, vernacular of the various chakras. It's associated with the second chakra, the vital center, the center of vitality, And when the anesthesiologist gives the person on the operating table a general anesthetic, it knocks the etheric body out of the physical to a large degree, so that not only is there no sensation, but there's no vitality either. And that's why you sign a disclosure, a non-indemnification disclosure, so that to let the anesthesiologist off the hook in case you should die on the operating table. He'll try his best, and he does know his job, but accidents do happen. If he gives you too much anesthetic, or if you overreact to it, you could die if all of your vitality gets pushed out of your physical body, because the vitality is the link between the astral and the physical. And when that link is not there, the astral has no connection to the physical, and it's left to wander the physical plane in that person's astral body for the rest of its natural life until its lifespan expires, but it's no longer tied to the physical, and so the physical is dead. But we can partially make it dead with a partial administration of a general anesthetic, so that at least it won't have any response to organic manipulation of the body, and the sensory organs of touch and pain receptors, so that they cannot send their information to the astral body, because it's the astral body in which we recognize sensations such as pain. This is all according to Charlie Lutz, okay, at this point. But in terms of Eric Dollard, the lines of force, transverse never ends on a point. It just loops on itself. surrounding a point to which that magnetic field emanates, that ripple that's basically circular in orbit around the point. But a longitudinal starts on a point and ends on another point, and it could be distant light years apart. It doesn't matter, because as far as longitudinal goes, the longer the distance, the faster the energy will travel beyond the speed of light. It literally speeds up because of a condition in which counter space is in opposition to space when it comes to distance. So when we're dealing with longitudinal waves in counter space, when the counter space distance shrinks, the spatial component lengthens, and vice versa. So the greater the spatial distance, the shorter the longitudinal distance in counter space that the longitudinal wave has to travel, and thus it appears to us in space to be traveling even faster than the speed of light, rather than slower. But it's just an appearance. It's a misperception on our part, because we have to infer the counter space. We can't see it. But that's how capacitance, the reality of longitudinal waves, magnetodielectric waves, operate in counter space. And those are the only waves that travel anywhere, because transverse waves can't travel. All they can do is go around in circles, and that's what they do around an atom. It's called an electron orbit. And so there's no electrical flow down a wire. There's only the electrical flow in orbit around an atom, and that's it. The only flow down a wire is longitudinal, and it's not amperage. It's a changing electrostatic field across space. That's electricity. Because the voltage level, the electron volts of every atom, copper atom, is going to change over time as the appearance of a transverse wave travels down the wire. It's just an appearance, just like people doing the wave in a stadium. It's just an appearance. But we're misled to believe it's something real, but it's not. It's an abstraction. And this is why we get fooled, because nobody teaches us the difference between abstract mind and concrete mind. An abstract mind is geared for pattern recognition. But a pattern is not an object. It's an abstract idea. So when we see a ripple, if we put dye in the water of a pond and then send a ripple across, that dye doesn't move for the most part. Yeah, a few molecules will move in the direction of the wave. Some will move in some other direction. But most of it will just stay there while the ripple goes past it. Because the ripple is an anomaly. It's not a wave. It's an abstract idea that our brain conjures up. All that's happening is the waves are going, the water's going up and down over time in different positions, and the copper atoms, the electron volts, will rise or fall. The electron orbit will expand or contract over time, creating the appearance of an abstraction that we call a ripple wave or a transverse wave, while in reality there's no motion taking place down the length of that wire at all. At all. There's information going down the wire, but that's not energy. It's just information to let the next copper atom know, okay, it's your turn now to bump your electron volts of your, some of your valence electrons up a notch, so because now I'm depleting, so there's no energy transfer between those two copper atoms. If anything gets transferred, it's longitudinal, but that's not energy. That's electron volts. There's no amps involved, and that means there's no electricity involved. It's strictly voltage, changing over time in different positions of the copper wire down its length, that creates the anomaly that we call electron flow of current, but there's no such animal. It doesn't exist. Not that way, not that geometry. The only current is that electron volt of that electron spinning around in orbit around the atom. That's it. That's your amperage right there. So that's why this rotating vessel of helium in the center of Joseph Newman's energy device is perfect for creating amperage, because it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to go and spin around in circles. and create an amperage that doesn't go anywhere. There'll be some loss. There's always thermodynamic, second and third law or thermodynamic losses. But that's it. There's nothing being consumed because it's a rotating magnetic field. You really think that the magnetic field of a generator at an AC power hydroelectric dam plant, electric power plant, is spending electricity in the form of spending the magnetic field of the coils? Jim Murray made it very plain that Bechtel steel in Michigan, it cost them a humongous amount of electrical power bill charge to charge up the field coils of all their gravel moving equipment and be billed for that, even though at the end of the day, when they turned off all their equipment, all the energy would go back to the grid. They didn't get that. They didn't get to turn their meter backwards and get that billing back, that surcharge back. They were billed for that. And so he went in there and put a synchronous motor or a synchronous generator in there, and the power company didn't like it, and Bechtel said, we're going to keep doing it. And so long as Jim Murray had a job there, they kept saving money. And the minute he left, they got rid of it, and the power company started charging them all over again, just like they were before Jim Murray had set that up. It takes no consumable energy, permanently consumable energy, to energize a rotating field, because you get it all back again when you turn the thing off. Because it doesn't go anywhere. It stays in the rotating field. So in actuality, I have to correct myself, there's nothing consumable here. The magnetism is not getting consumed, and neither is the voltage. In fact, if anything, we got a slight overunity in which the rotating magnetism can recharge the battery pack, because it's losing. In order to charge up the coil with any kind of volts, it's got to deplete itself of some amps. But the rotating helium-filled vessel is making up the difference, so that the battery pack can get recharged. So we literally have a perpetual motion machine which is not consuming anything. Literally. And it's linked back to itself, which is the whole definition of perpetual motion, that you take the output and link it back to the input. Worst of all, it's got extra. That's just the electrical part is linked back to itself, but that's not what it's designed to carry an extra load for. That's just the load of running itself. The extra load is the kinetic energy based on all the voltage that's built up in the 15,000 massive Henry coil. So now you can run a sump pump, or what's a good example of an electric motor? What do they call those things? A forklift, in which you have only one speed, right? It's like a golf cart. You have only one speed for the tires to drive that thing around, and you have one speed to raise the forklift, and that you don't get extra speeds. You don't get to accelerate. You either engage the energy or you don't engage the energy for either lifting the forklift or moving the forklift forward or backward, and that's it. And so that's a perfect example, because your electric drive motor runs at only one speed, on or off. And that's literally the kind of electric motor situation that Joseph Newman's energy device could be used for. But we're like a conveyor belt in a bottling factory. You're bottling ketchup, and you've got a one set speed, or a printing press. You have one set, printing presses might have more than one speed. Let's assume one speed. For a printing press, for a bottling company, bottling ketchup, or what else? An AC unit, or a heating unit on a home or a building. That's the only time it would be useful. Not an electric car. I don't know where Newman was getting his ideas from, thinking you could drive an electric car, but it's not practical. Sure, you could do it, but you'd be doing it the hard way. So it's like a waste of time. Now you could use it to run a generator, and then the generator could drive your, well, it could recharge a battery pack, a separate battery pack. You know, you've got your 9 volts running the system, your power system, but then you'd have your regular battery pack driving your electric motor for your car, and that could be supplied by a generator that's being driven by. So I guess Newman was right. It could be done, but you have to scale things up, and that means multiple opportunities for losing, in terms of, you know, loss of efficiency, losing energy. But the power system itself that Joseph Newman devised literally is perpetual motion because it doesn't consume anything. But it is not over unity. It is, I guess you could say it's free energy, I suppose, but it's not over unity because you do have to account for everything. And then it's not over unity if you account for all the energy sources. But because of this feature that Eric Dollard has taught us, that electrical energy can be synthesized and it can be decomposed from or to its constituent ingredients of time, electrostatics, and magnetism, you don't consume anything if you know what you're doing. If you take everything apart and not try to make it too simple, because if you make it too simple, like a flashlight circuit, the only reason why it's so simple is because ignorance is bliss, and we don't take into account the complexity of fabricating a battery, recharging a battery, because that battery is going to get spent in a flashlight circuit. And we have to take the time to turn off the flashlight or swap out. Maybe you have another battery waiting in readiness, and you switch quickly to your new fresh battery so you don't have much interruption of your flashlight, and then you can take out the spent battery and put in a new one to be sitting in readiness for when this new battery gets spent. But there's all this complexity of maintaining the battery, the state of charge of the battery. So there's nothing truly as simple as a flashlight circuit, because that's really a state of ignorance on our part. We choose to be ignorant. We don't have to be. All we have to do is sit down and think about it, or stand if you prefer, or fall down flat and lie flat on the ground. But whatever, just give some time to think about it. A flashlight circuit is ultimately not as simple as it appears to be. And it doesn't take any intelligence to figure it out. It just takes the willingness to think about it. That's all, just the willingness. The brain is like any other muscle. It gets better through use. And if you don't use it, it turns to mush. Use it or lose it, right? That's what Charlie List would always say.